all for coming out on a Thursday evening before spring break. It's nice to see so many faces here. If you saw the flyer, you may have noticed I changed the punctuation here, and I've added a question mark to the title. And the reason I did that is because I want this to be more of a question to start a conversation. So I'll talk here for however long, 40 minutes, an hour or so, and then we'll have a Q&A. And I really would like to sort of hear your all's thoughts, engage in a discussion about this. Where the question we're asking ourselves, is it possible to make sense of there being morality without God? And I want to think of that question in the context of what's called the Euthyphro dialogue and the dilemma that comes out of the Euthyphro dialogue. So as Jesse said, here's our Socratic Society. I wanted to make sure that they got special sort of props for putting this together and for the awesome discussions we have every Wednesday. So please feel free to join us. It's open very much to non-philosophers, philosophers, anybody's welcome. So let's go ahead and get started. When I was thinking about this talk, I had in mind two different goals. One of them is a very specific goal. And the very specific goal for this talk is to think about this question, can we have morality without God, in the context of the Euthyphro dialogue. So this was a Platonic dialogue, and it was written in the 4th century BCE, so a very old dialogue. Nevertheless, the lessons we draw from it are applicable to the sorts of questions we're thinking about today. So it's this really amazing dialogue. Plato does an awesome job in the character of Socrates talking about this exact issue, and I think it's a great example of one of the ways philosophy can be very helpful and very fruitful to the discussions we're having in all the different disciplines across the university today. So, my second sort of goal or objective is a more general goal or objective. So the specific one is just highlight the Euthyphro. The general one here is I want to try to see if I can drive a wedge between the idea that God has to be connected with morality, that there's some sort of strong or tight or necessary bond between God and morality. And the reason I want to do that is I want to see if we can motivate the claim that one need not be a theist, one need not believe in God in order to be a moral person. All right, so two very sort of different goals, but both important for the purpose of the talk. And then I thought about, okay, given that those are my goals, who are my audience that I'm trying to get those goals, accomplish those goals with? Well, on the one hand, I have in mind the theist here. Because I think the moral argument is a very important argument that both sides of this debate can consider. And the thing I want the theist to think about with regard to the moral argument is to actually think about just giving it up. Because I think it's a really bad argument. And we'll get into what the moral argument is here in a second. But I want to I want to try to convince you today that the cost of accepting this moral argument is going to be too high. And we're going to have to abandon it in favor of other arguments for God's existence. So effectively, I want the theist to stop wasting time on a bad argument. On the other side, I have in mind the atheist. And I talk about this, over the years I've talked about this dilemma a lot with my students. And I have a pretty common response that students will give me, which is, well, of course God has nothing to do with morality. And what I think the Euthyphro dilemma does is it gives someone who wants to assert that, it gives but in particular it gives the atheist good rational reason for rejecting the idea that God has anything to do with morality. And why that's important is it avoids us just butting heads, right? So we don't want to get ourselves into a position in a debate where all we're sort of doing is yelling at each other, knocking our head together like two bull moose and rut or something. It's Alaska. It's an Alaskan analogy, right? But we want to avoid just yelling at each other. We want to have a rational discourse. It's perfectly legitimate for both sides on this issue to have a rational discourse. And this is the way we can do it. I think this is the end for us on either side to be thinking about God's connection with morality. But as I said, I've talked about the Youth for a Dilemma, and a few of my students are in here today, and you all know that I like the Youth for a Dilemma. I always talk about it in my ethics class. But I wanted to think about some broader ramifications for the Youth for a Dilemma in the public sphere, in our public debates. And as I was thinking about that, I remembered that I had read a pretty neat little bit of data from a sociological article called Atheist is Other, Moral Boundaries and Cultural Membership in American Society. And that is from the American Sociological Review, 2006. And the bit of data they give us, the bit of data the report presents, the article presents, comes from their trying to figure out how the atheist is considered in the private sphere and in the public sphere. So they ask two separate questions. The first question is from a number of different groups. And the groups included Muslim, conservative Christian, homosexual, African American, white American, there were a handful of other groups. And atheists were one of those. From these groups, does a member of that group agree with your vision of American society? So that's sort of the first question. The second question, so that's the public sphere question. The private sphere question is, how comfortable would you be with a member of this group dating your child? Right? So what's really notable about these two questions, and about the results they got, is the atheists scored drastically lower than any other group. By like 12 to 15%. Right? That's a fairly large number in a study like this. Which they use to sort of try to draw up a point that the atheist, for some reason, is the most, well, I'll say the most reviled of the groups they looked at, but it's the most other, right? So the idea of other is just, it's, we think of a member of that group as being maybe not human or as being totally unlike us, as being other. And the atheists on both of these standards, or both of these questions, scored very, very low. But in addition to that quantitative data, they had some interviews that went along with these experiments. And I found the quotes, there's just a couple of choice quotes from this article, to be very telling. So this is interviews from Los Angeles field site. The prisons are probably filled with people who don't have any kind of spiritual or religious core. Why would you think that? Right? Why would you think that? Unless you thought that there's a necessary connection between God and morality. This other quote, I'll say it again, some religious belief, I don't care who or what you worship, just something to give you that stability. Again, reflecting that idea that you have to have God in the picture to be a moral person. All right. They also, in this article, point to some other similar research. This is from a public agenda poll. And the Farkas et al. 2001 is the report that went along with that poll. And here we have this quote, if more Americans were more religious, people believe that crime would go down, families would do a better job raising their children, people would be more likely to help each other. Indeed, most Americans fear that the country would decline if people lost their religious faith. So again, we see this idea that there's some sort of necessary connection between God and morality. If you don't have God in the picture, you're not going to have morality. So that's sort of the atheist in public. But there's also some really notable considerations about the atheist in politics that I've sort of been struck by lately. So looking at that same public agenda report and some recent Gallup polls, you get an indication of how unlikely it would be for an atheist to achieve public office, and in particular the presidency. You can think about the debates you see on the news right now. You can think about the political climate right now. How likely, like how well do you think an atheist would do on either side of the aisle, Republican or Democrat, in these polls? I mean, I guess my intuition here is they would not fare very well, and they would not fare very well for the sorts of ideas I saw expressed. I found in the Reno Gazette-Journal, and this really nice opinion piece put an atheist on the Supreme Court. So I'm going to read just in full the quotes. This one's from the Reno Gazette-Journal. It's from an interview with a gentleman named Steve B. Bond, who's a senior pastor of Summit Christian Church. Denying God's existence leads to moral fuzziness. Because if God does not exist, then there can be no objective standard of right and wrong. As a result, right and wrong are determined by whatever seems appropriate, instead of following an objective moral standard established by God himself. For this reason, it would be foolish to elect a president who is an atheist. The president needs clear moral bearings to make wise decisions, and the office of the president provides an overarching moral compass for our nation. But if an objective moral compass does not exist in the president's heart because of atheism, or if the compass is falsely calibrated, then disastrously unwise decisions will result. Being a believer in God does not necessarily not mean the president will be an ideal leader, but it is usually suggests that the president will have morally clear worldview, and this is vital. The quote from this opinion piece put an atheist on the Supreme Court, and this opinion piece was by Lawrence Krauss, who's sort of a pop science figure. You may have heard some of his books. Can't think of the title of it right now, but
why do we have something instead of nothing?
Why do we have something instead of nothing? So Lawrence Krauss writes, such an appointment would also help counter the perceived connection between atheism and lawlessness and immorality. So this is the appointment of an atheist to the Supreme Court. That unfortunate and inaccurate link is made all too often in the United States. A Pew survey conducted last month, so that'd be back in January of this year, showed that once again Americans would be less likely to vote for an atheist candidate than for a candidate who has no experience, is gay, was involved in financial improprieties, has had extramarital affairs, or is Muslim. Atheists are widely, absurdly, and openly mistrusted. So taking all that together, we have a nice graph, and this comes from the sociological article I just pointed us to. And what's notable here is, I guess, a couple of things. One thing that I find notable is that there is an overall trend towards tolerance in America. So that's really cool. Right? That's a really good result. Overall, all of these groups, and if you can't really see it, I guess you probably can, Catholic, Jewish, African-American, atheist, homosexual, there's a notable trend towards tolerance. But the other thing I find very fascinating is atheists lag far behind on that trend. So there's still a very large gap in tolerance between atheists and these other groups. So what I want to offer today is a conjecture that says the intuitions that drive the popular and political stigmas against atheism are those same intuitions that are at play in the moral argument for God's existence that the Euthyphro dilemma addresses. And that intuition is that the only available source of morality is God. This is not a new intuition. It's a nice passage. I sort of was having a conversation with a colleague of mine down in Oregon about this, and he pointed out, well, in Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky says, if God is dead, everything is permitted. And then we discovered, no, it actually is this quote. But it's a worry. It's a worry that's being expressed in Brothers Karamazov. But, I asked, how will man be after that, without God in the future life? It means everything is permitted now. One can do anything. So it's not an assertion, it's a question. It's a worry that this character is expressing. If we take God and immortal life out of the picture, aren't we taking morality out of the picture? So my first goal is to demonstrate that the reasons we have for rejecting the moral argument will also be good reasons for us to reject the common intuition that drives that quote, that drives all that data from the polls and from these sociological experiments. And in doing so, we're going to be able to close the tolerance gap between the atheist and other groups. And again, I have the theist in mind for this talk as well. And what I would hopefully show the theist, hopefully convince the theist, is that the moral argument, which is often used as a fallback position in the context of other arguments for God's existence, is actually hurting the theist and not helping him. It's doing the theist's position damage to fall back to this moral argument, given how bad the moral argument turns out to be. And I would hope to, at the end of the talk, I'm going to encourage the theist to seek out better arguments. So the moral argument, this is the meat and potatoes of the talk. The first premise of the moral argument just says morality exists. We'll call this the moral premise. And I want this to be a fairly tame premise, a fairly tame claim or proposition being made. So as long as at least some everyday moral statements or claims are true, then we have ourselves the moral premise. That's all we need for the existence of morality. We don't need every claim to be true. We don't need there to be absolute claims. We just need some moral claims to be true. If we have that, we have that morality exists. Because of that, I want this claim to be very uncontroversial. So whatever conception of morality you have, that's all I need. I don't want to argue about that. I want that to be a very uncontroversial premise. So just plug in your favorite moral system, your favorite conception of morality, just so long as that morality exists. Right? So in other words, the only thing I'm really doing here is denying moral nihilism. Where moral nihilism is just the position that says there is no morality. Any other system on the table I'm good with. That's all I need for the moral premise. But it's important to note that there cannot be a theistic assumption in this premise. You can't build in God at this step, because if you do so, you're going to get yourself into a circular argument. You're going to be begging the question, which is a big no-no. And if you want to know why, come take my logic class. So that gives us our second premise. This is actually a very straightforward and simple argument. There's only two premises and a conclusion. The second premise is what I'm going to call the theistic premise. It simply asserts, it's the proposition, that if God did not exist, then morality would not exist. And this is the premise that asserts the connection between God and morality. And it asserts that the only adequate foundation for moral truths is God. The only way to make sense of that first premise is by appeal to God. Our final step then, therefore, God exists. It's a very simple argument. It's a very powerful argument if it works. It is formally valid. It follows the form of modus tollens. This is one of our valid argument forms. And the nice thing about a valid argument, the beautiful thing about a valid argument is if the premises are true, you got all the certainty in the world that the conclusion is true. The conclusion absolutely must follow if the premises are true, and it's a valid argument. So it's a valid argument. We just got to go figure out if the premises are true. If we find out that they are, then we have to accept the conclusion. Have to. Rationally have to accept the conclusion that God exists. So this is a really strong argument. It's a really powerful argument. So let's take a look at those premises. Let's figure out if we have what is called a sound argument, which is a valid argument with true premises. So again, I just want to grant the truth of the moral premise. I don't want to argue about this one. I just want to assume it for the sake of this argument. I want it to be very neutral on the scope of the moral claims, on how broad the moral claims need to be. So long as at least some moral claims are true, then the moral premise is true. All right, so we can maybe talk about this moral premise in the Q&A, but for the purpose of this argument, I just want to sort of barge on ahead and think about the status of the theistic premise. That is, I want to think if we have any reason to accept it as true. And I think initially, it seems like there's good motivation for it. Because we might think, well look, morality is just a system of laws, and laws require a lawgiver. That's how we have the laws of the United States. Somebody had to make them up. There had to be a lawgiver. And moral laws work the same way. But of course, moral laws are pre-existing to government institutions, so the government can't be the lawgiver for moral laws. Indeed, the only thing that can act as the lawgiver for moral laws is God. So I think that's one pretty, on the face of it, plausible motivation for accepting the moral argument, for accepting that theistic premise. The other motivation we might have is just, we look around and we realize, we can't come up with any grounds for the truth of morality. Maybe we think the world out there is kind of impure, and so it can't itself fulfill the role that is required for moral truths. Maybe we have an idea like that. Maybe we think moral truths are so weird that they can't be out there in the physical world. Right? So maybe we think the only place we can find moral truth is in God. And again, I think on the face of it, that's a pretty good suggestion. What I'm hoping to do today is actually undercut those suggestions and show that they're not really good motivations for accepting the truth of the theistic premise. And because I said this is a valid premise, if the argument fails and I'm accepting that first premise, this premise must be false. It's got to fail here. If the argument fails at all, it fails here, and it's going to fail because God cannot provide the grounds for morality. I've been teaching all day, so my throat's a little scratchy. Okay, so let's examine the theistic premise. Enter the Euthyphro dilemma. And the Euthyphro dilemma, coming from the Euthyphro dialogue, written by Plato, the early 4th century, BCE, more than 2,000 years ago, very simply asks, what, if any, is God's connection to morality? That's the question. How do we connect God up with morality in such a way that the theistic premise turns out to be true? Well, we got two options. Option one tells us that it's God's commanding things that makes those things morally good or morally right. Right? So God thinks about something, says, "Thou shalt not kill." And the moment God says that, killing is now wrong. I like to think of the Ten Commandments here as a way to think about this option. Right? There was no right or wrong. God gave the world the Ten Commandments. All of a sudden there is right and wrong. Clearly that's not the point in the story at which God makes right and wrong, but it's a nice image for us to use. We call this divine command theory for obvious reasons. So that's option one. That's option one. But maybe the way God connects up with morality, maybe the way that God is necessary for morality, is if God commands things because they're morally good or morally right. So there, on that picture, you have some stuff. You already have some actions that are right or wrong. God, in His infinite wisdom and goodness, thinks about those things, realizes that those are the right things to do, and then commands all of us to do them. And here again, I think the Ten Commandments actually works pretty well. It's just now, instead of God creating the Ten Commandments through His commands, He reports the Ten Commandments. So He reads the moral face of the universe and reports on it to us. So those are the options outlined in the Euthyphro dilemma. we call it a dilemma? There's a nice image philosophers like to use when we're talking about dilemmas. And the image is of a bull. And a bull has two big old nasty sharp horns. And just like the bull, either way you go in the dilemma, you're going to get gored. So that's the imagery. So both of these options seem to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. You have to pick one or the other, and you cannot pick both. And there does not appear to be a third option. So let's examine the consequences here. All right, on option one, on divine command theory, there are a number of traditional sort of commitments, consequences that follow from accepting the divine command theory horn of this dilemma. So, we think about this. Okay, we think about this. Well, if God's commands make an action right or wrong, good or bad, then it seems like morality is contingent. And what that really means is it is a certain way, but it could be another way. It could have been another way, it could right now be another way, or it could in the future be another way. And some theists at least take this to be a little troubling. And the reason they take it to be troubling is, imagine something that is obviously the right thing to do. Let's say helping your neighbor out when they're in trouble. Right? One of the things this is my third year in Alaska. One of the things I first noticed up here is that if you're broken down on the side of the road, like, you can barely get out of your car before someone stops and helps you out. Right? So something like that, something that's obviously the right thing to do. Well, maybe next week, all of a sudden, God decides to make that the wrong thing to do. And because we're on the divine command theory horn, it would be the wrong thing to do. And at least some people have the intuition that morality shouldn't be that malleable. It shouldn't be able to change like that. It should be necessary and not contingent. Now at this point I want to mention that I don't want to suggest that there are not responses to each of these commitments. I think in a lot of cases there are some very ready responses available to the theist. I'm just sort of marking out the traditional commitments that follow from accepting either form. And again, we can sort of talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. But the next commitment seems to be that morality is arbitrary. And to call morality arbitrary is just to say that there's nothing really backing it up. There doesn't really seem to be any reasons to support morality. It's arbitrary. My slide works. That's particularly troubling for some theists. Because if there can be no reasons, if morality is truly arbitrary, and there can be no reasons backing up morality, then God, in deciding what to command, can't appeal to anything, right? There's nothing there for God to appeal to. And so God can have no moral reasons for his commands, and they become simply the whim or fancy of God. Whatever God sort of finds himself wanting to command that day is what he commands. And that, again, that seems pretty problematic. Especially, as a lot of traditional theists do, if you think of God as a perfectly rational being. So God can only act if God has good reason to act. On the divine command horn, God can't have good reason for the commands he gives. What might be worse than that is if God has no reasons, if morality is arbitrary, it kind of looks like God just becomes a bully. That is, the only reason he can give is because I said so. I like to think of this as the parental command theory. You know? Why do I gotta clean my room? Because I said so. Yeah, it's probably not great. It's probably not great for God to come out as a bully, to not be able to offer good reasons for his commands. And it gets worse if we think about, again, at least traditionally, if we look at, say, Scripture, some of the truly horrible things seemingly commanded by God. And here we have examples of genocide, of rape, of filicide, right? Killing your own child. Those seem like pretty horrible things. And if the only reason God can give for commanding them is because I said so, oh man, I don't know. That seems problematic. That conception of God makes me start to worry if we're even talking about God at all in that case. But that's actually not the most worrisome of the lot. What I identify as the real problem, the really truly deep problem of the divine command theory horn is that God cannot be good if we accept option one. And that's a weird claim, isn't it? That God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being, can't be good? And the reason God can't be good is because, think about that, what makes something good, what makes an action good, or the right thing to do, is that God commands it. So calling God good is just saying of God that he does whatever he says he's going to do. Or he follows his own commands. But that strikes me as a super weird thing to say about the nature of goodness. We don't normally think of goodness as being that way. You can imagine if I tell you my colleague Eduardo is the absolute most virtuous, best person I know. Because he's true, right? He always does exactly what he says he ought to do. And yesterday he told me, you know, Seth, this weekend I really feel like I ought to go boil some puppy dogs alive. And I know Eduardo, he's the best person I know. I know he's going to do it. That's not what we mean by goodness. No! We mean usually something like, is not the sort of person that would boil puppy dogs alive. That's a really bad thing to do. But again, on this option, on this horn of the dilemma, what you get is, because goodness just amounts to whatever God commands, calling God good is just saying God does whatever God commands. And I really want us to think about why in the world we would worship such a being. Right? If God's goodness just amounts to kind of God does whatever he wants, why is such a being worthy of adulation? All right? So that's the divine command theory horn. That's option one. You can see why you're getting gored if you accept this one. So what about option two? Well, we'll call this one moral realism. And maybe we've now convinced ourselves, yeah, option one's pretty bad, we don't want that. Well, if we take option two, pretty good. We say God's goodness. Morality is out there in the world, and God is good because God is the most moral being. God never does anything contrary to morality. That's pretty good. Where morality is independent of God now. So that's pretty good. We say God's goodness. It also allows God to have rational reasons for commanding what he does. So again, pause for a coffee break. God is trying to decide what to command, being all good. He appeals to the moral truths that are out there in the universe, recognizes them, and uses them as reasons. He commands what he does because those commands are the good commands. And finally, goodness does not have to be contingent. We just make it a necessary feature of the world. So it can't change in the way that we were worried about before. Of course, I said that this is a horn of the dilemma, and we're going to get ourselves gored. So there are traditionally a few commitments to follow. The first one, I'm not sure how bad this one is. Again, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But traditionally, there's this worry that, well, if we accept moral realism, then something, that is morality, it exists outside of God's commands. It's a limitation on what God is able to do. It's something that God did not create. And this would limit God's omnipotence. Right? If we understand omnipotence to be God can do whatever he wills, well, now we have a whole host of things God simply cannot do. That is anything immoral. He also can't change morality. But that's not the big one. The big one is that if we accept moral realism, then we do not need God to explain the existence of morality. Because we've already said morality exists outside of God's control. Morality is not dependent on God's commands. It's not dependent on God's creative power. And we get ourselves into a situation where the theistic premise is false and the moral argument is unsound. That is, we have a false premise, we need not accept the conclusion. All right. So we might ask ourselves, well, okay, that looks pretty bad. Is this the end of the ball game? Are we just done at this point? Because this divine command theory looks pretty problematic. It looks like we probably don't want to accept that. The consequences of accepting it are sort of too onerous or too problematic, so we shouldn't accept that one. But if we go the other way, we have to give up the moral argument. Well, maybe we can save divine command theory. One thing we might try to say, in an effort to save divine command theory here, to be able to accept that first horn without all of its problems, is we might say, well, look, God would never command that. And that attempts to avoid the problem with option one that we had where we said, God becomes a bully, God can command really horrible things, goodness becomes completely dependent on God's whim. You say, look, God would never, there's certain things, so boiling puppy dog's alive. God would never command that. That's just not a thing God would command. The challenge, the difficulty there, is it's really unclear how we can say that. Because if there's no morality outside of God's commands, there's nothing stopping God from commanding you all this Saturday at 12 p.m., get together and boil 20 different varieties of puppy dogs. I don't know why that's my favorite example. It's been my favorite example for years. Probably speaks something about my moral character.
Or puppy dog.
Or puppy dogs. Yeah, that's true. So, so just to reiterate that point, because this is pretty crucial. Morality does not exist on the divine command theory horn until God commands things. And at that point, it's too late. Right? Because there's nothing stopping God from commanding all sorts of terrible things. Because morality does not exist until after God's commands. So prior to God's commanding something, there's nothing that stops God from commanding whatever. The most horrendous of all horrendous things is available to God because it's not wrong. It's not horrendous at that point. So it's really hard to see how this option gets us anywhere. So another option might be to make goodness a fundamental feature, a necessary feature, an essential feature of God's nature. And that's pretty cool. It saves God's goodness by just saying, look, it's just God is good. We're starting there. We're going to start there. Okay? And then we know that because God is good, there's all sorts of things God cannot do. And this does put a limit on God's nature. It puts a limit on what God can do. But it's actually okay, because God limits himself. There's no external constraints on God. And so it doesn't seem like we have any problem for God's omnipotence, because there's nothing outside of God cutting off God's power. It's all sort of internal. It's all from within. This also seems to work pretty well, because God is necessary. And God necessarily has all of his features. So that God is all-powerful. That God is eternal. That God is omnipresent. Right? And that God is good are just necessary features of God. So no contingency enters the picture here. We're doing pretty well. And of course, if God is good, God can appeal to his own nature, right? His own good nature, to give himself reasons for commanding what he does. So morality is no longer arbitrary. So again, this is looking pretty good. This is looking pretty good. And I think it would get us out of trouble if it works. So let's figure out if it works. Do we really have a third option? Are we splitting the horns of the dilemma? So are we like the bull's charging at us and we do a neat ninja flip and like jump between the horns and get on its back? That's this option, if it works. If it doesn't work, we're going to get pretty, again, like extra gory, because now the bull's even more mad that we tried to avoid it. Well, thinking about God's nature being good seems like it pushes the problem back a level. Because we still have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to say God is good? When we want to say God's nature is necessarily good, what are we meaning? What do our words mean in this context? Well, one thing we might mean comes from the view that God is self-caused. So God, somehow, in some way that we're not able to understand, obviously, right? Because I have no idea. I personally have never had experience with self-causing things. But in some way, God's able to do that we're not. God causes himself to come into being. And when he does that, he gives himself a good nature. But of course, the tricky part here is that you've just said that God's creative power controls goodness. That is, you're putting goodness back into the hands of God's desires. And that was just the problem with the divine command theory. It was the fact that goodness was a part of God's unrestrained power or desire that led to those problems in the first place. All right, fair enough. So maybe God's not self-caused. Maybe God is eternal and uncreated. And God's nature is eternally, uncreatedly good. Okay, not bad. That obviously avoids the problem with divine command theory. Because now, God's nature, it just is what it is. It's eternal, it's uncreated, there's nothing that has control over it, it just is good. The problem there is that it makes goodness and morality a fundamental feature of the universe. In this instance, it's a fundamental feature of the universe, fundamental feature of a part of the universe, God, but it's still a fundamental feature of the universe. But of course, that was just what the moral realist horn of the dilemma claims. That's precisely the claim of moral realism. Morality is a fundamental feature of the universe. And it's not clear why we would need to make it a fundamental feature of God. So the third option seems like it collapses right back into the original dilemma, and we've gotten nowhere by introducing this idea that goodness is just a fundamental feature of God's nature. Okay, so if the moral argument is in trouble, if that theistic premise is in trouble, then we need to offer some alternative explanations for the moral premise. Because we've just accepted it as true, and in the original argument, the theistic premise was meant to explain the truth of it. Well, one option we might offer up is society and culture is the source of morality. Right? So it's the desires or the decisions or the actions or predilections of a society or culture that make a moral claim true or false. And I think this is a pretty popular alternative. I think it's deeply problematic for a variety of reasons. And we could sort of talk about it in the Q&A if you all like this option. One potentially problematic result of accepting that society or culture is the source of morality is that you can't have moral disagreement between cultures. And that might seem problematic if we think of another culture that, say, engages in the practice of slavery, that they're doing something immoral. It also has a problem that you can't say of a member of the culture who seems, say, I don't know, Martin Luther King, who seems to be doing something morally virtuous, morally laudable. You actually have to say of that person that they're doing something wrong. Because the morality, moral truths are being decided by the culture, and they're going against their culture. And that seems a little weird, but as I said, we can talk about that in the Q&A. For now, it's an option. I'm not particularly fond of it, but it's out there. Another option we might offer is non-naturalism. So non-naturalism just says, look, moral properties are a fundamental feature of the world, but they're not like the stuff that biologists and physicists study. There's some other type of thing. There's some other type of property, but they're just as real as quarks or genes or molecules, whatever, what have you. And maybe we know them through some sort of innate moral faculty, right? We're able to access, you all can see the monitor because you have sight. You can hear my voice because, you have ears, you have hearing. Well, in the same way, maybe we have a moral faculty that gets us at fundamental moral truths. And a philosopher named G.E. Moore is of this opinion. Maybe instead of some special moral faculty, we just use our reason. And Immanuel Kant is kind of the most famous of philosophers who thinks that reason can get us at the fundamental moral truths of the world. Right? So we got some options. Maybe you don't like non-naturalism though, maybe you want to go to naturalism. Moral truths are a fundamental feature of the world, but they're just like any other feature of the world. So maybe we want to give an evolutionary account of morality and talk about just like any other feature, just like any other property a being has as a result of evolution, it also has these moral properties. Maybe if you don't like the evolutionary story, you want to go with a story that grounds moral truths in biological and psychological facts about humans. And just as an example, one of my personal favorite philosophers, David Hume, gives an account like this. He talks about some innate responses we have to the world, and then traces that get carved out in our brain matter. In our language today, it would be something like connections that get built up in a neural connectionist network, right? That just are the foundation of our morality. But something like that. And we can give it more. We have we have the technology, we have the science to give perhaps a more nuanced account. And actually, neuroethics is a really growing and popular field in philosophy these days that are trying to do just that. But for our purposes, we have options. We have a way to explain the moral truths of moral claims without appealing to God. Okay. Almost done, I promise. So what about the theist? Remember I said I wanted to give the theist something to bite into here as well. Well, I'm hoping I've convinced you that divine command theory is too onerous to accept. And that we ought to reject the moral argument because of the problems of divine command theory in favor of other arguments. Now, I myself am super partial to traditional argument that calls for the need for a necessary existence. So it's sort of like the first cause argument. For those of you who are familiar with the first cause argument, it's a little bit different. It says anything that exists in this world, in the material world, is contingent. And because it's contingent, you need to explain its existence. You need to offer an explanation for its existence. Well, if your only options for explaining the existence of a contingent thing is some other contingent thing, then you're going to get yourself into an infinite regress where you have no explanation whatsoever. Because if I'm only explaining the existence of this contingent thing, only if I can explain the existence of this contingent thing, only if I can explain the existence of this contingent thing, I can do that all day, but I only have 7 minutes left. I'm in trouble. So what I need is a necessary existent. Because the nice thing about a necessary existent is they do not need explanation. They don't need a reason for why they exist. So, you get a necessary existent, because otherwise you don't have anything else. Let's call that necessary existent God. Of course, the problem there is the onus is going to be on the theist to show that the necessary existent has the traditional features associated with God. For example, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, omniscience, omnipotence. And that's an especially hard task because I can't use a mouse. Because it's not at all clear why the universe couldn't just fulfill that role. If we needed a necessary existence, fine. The universe is necessary. You're off to the races. So if we go that route, the theist has to offer some additional reasons for thinking such a necessary being would be God. Descartes tries to do this, so maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A. I'm not sure how far he gets, but he does at least try to show that a necessary being has to have all the rest of the features of God. So maybe we need to go to some brand new arguments. And here, I admit, I don't have much to offer. But that's okay, because my goal today was just to convince you that you're wasting your time on the moral argument. And so go out and find some new arguments. Stop thinking about the moral argument. You're wasting brain power thinking about the moral argument. You're not going to be able to save it. Give it up. Go find something better. But the main lesson today is that skip the slide. The main lesson today is that the moral argument, the cost is too high, because the only way to save it is to accept the divine command theory. All right, so let's go back to the beginning of my talk. My conjecture was that the intuitions that drive the popular political stigmas against the atheist are the same as those we find in the moral argument. And that intuition in particular is that the only available source of morality is God. I hope I've convinced you at this point that Eve for dilemma weakens this intuition, because God cannot be the source of morality. The only way God could be the source of morality is by accepting divine command theory, but then you end up with some pretty weird things you're saying about God. And again, for me, the worst one being you have to give up God's goodness. And that's pretty weird, especially if God is going to be the source of morality. Because if God is not good, how could God be the source of morality? These other sources I mentioned are available to the theists and the atheists alike. So there's no special status the theist has with respect to being moral. So are there any other possible concerns to keep this intuition on the table, to sort of defeat what I'm trying to do here today? All right, maybe. Maybe we think of God as a reporter of morality. So on this picture, on this picture, we accept moral realism to avoid all the problems of divine command theory. It just turns out that the only way we, everyone in this room, being finite minds, have access to those moral truths that are a fundamental feature of the world is if God gives them to us. Because God's all-knowing, so God has access to them. None of us in this room do. So we need to keep God in the picture. We need to keep God in the picture as a reporter of morality, and since the atheist doesn't want to hear anything God has to say, the atheist doesn't get access to those moral truths. Again, I'm going to challenge that, just like I've been challenging everything else today, because we know a lot about the world. We know a lot about fundamental features of the world. And if morality is just another fundamental feature of the world, then there's, so far as I can see, absolutely no reason to expect that through rational inquiry and through scientific research, we couldn't also figure out morality. It's just like, so maybe this is me taking the naturalism option, but it's just like anything else. There's no reason to think that we couldn't ourselves gain access to the moral features of the world. But what about God as an enforcer of morality? And here again, I think this is a pretty popular option. There's the idea that the only reason any individual could have to be good is fear of punishment from God. Unfortunately, I want to say that fear of punishment is a really crappy ground for morality. Josh is a student of mine, and if I thought Josh were the sort of person that the only reason he didn't murder me in cold blood is because he was afraid of divine punishment, I'm going to think Josh is not a good person. And in particular, I don't think that such a selfish reason can be good grounds for morality. So I'm going to reject this option as well. And I'm going to conclude by saying that there's no reason to expect the atheist to be less or more moral than the theist. Thank you very much. Eduardo, could I have you feel like just sort of keep an eye on questions for me? So we have an hour left. I'd like to open up the Q&A now. I would love to engage in a dialogue with you about any of the things that came up in today's talk. Rich looks very excited. Yes, Rich.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to something that you started with, and I'm just very curious about the discussions you had about the social view in what I'm presuming is all-American reporting. And would that same result happen if you did that study in Scandinavia, for instance?
That is an excellent question. I don't know, is my answer. I don't know, Rich, what do you think? What's your intuition say on this? This is obviously an empirical question.
My intuition is this is a thoroughly American view of atheism that you're reflecting here. And it doesn't necessarily mean the rest of the world thinks that way.
I like that question. I'm going to write it down, sorry. Because I want to look into this. And I know I have at least one sociologist in the audience tonight, and I'm going to call on him to go do this research and find out. But yeah, it's a great question. I suppose I share your intuition, and I definitely am directing this at American audiences because that's my audience, but I think it's a great question. I would be curious to see how pervasive this intuition is, or if it's a result of a culturalization. Thanks, Rich. Sorry, who was it? Oh yeah, thanks.
Well, an animal behavioralist would say there's all kinds of morality in primates, carnivores, and so on. Very elaborate. All that work's going on right now with hundreds of people. Whole new clinics working on the new view of morality without the supernatural.
Okay, very good. I'm curious why they identify the behavior as moral or immoral. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
No, I think most of the behavior that you can see in a wolf pack, in a primate group, and everything depends or started in its early evolution with the genes. That is, you want to make sure your genes go to your kids, so you're very moral, very positive way with your kids, with your brother, with your parents, and so on in a band. But as you make the transition to a tribe, it involves a different kind of morality, a reciprocity. And then that becomes broader, so you can walk down the street even though it isn't of your tribe. You've expanded your the sort of people you will embrace because they're not going to kill you or hopefully not going to cheat you. So you have money that you can measure whether they're going to cheat you or not. And I guess you could call that plus or minus morality, but it's a guideline. Like a wolf can't kill a wolf within the pack. That's taboo.
Under normal conditions, certainly it does happen.
And the dominant wolf, the signal for that is to give his neck. If there's somebody who wants to put up a fight, he gives his neck for that animal to bite him.
So I like this.
And what that means is, look, if you bite me, then we lose the moral stick there. I can kill you. So the new wolf coming in from outside is a whole different moral system. So anyhow,
Yeah.
you can look at oxytocin, vasopressin, and the neurotransmitters, and build all these things up because
Yeah.
you can't. Unlike the social sciences that do this so often, they separate humans and animals. Hey, we're not an animal.
So I really like this account you're giving because
not
if
just
you
you.
recall one of my slides, I offered as another source of morality a naturalistic account.
But
And-
anyway, it was one sentence.
Sure. I'm giving it as a possibility, right? And I'm admitting that there are those possibilities out there. And I think that's pretty good, right? I think that's pretty good. I suppose I get maybe a little worried that, I'll say it this way. One role I really see philosophy fulfilling there, because there's a whole broad swath of philosophers who we call naturalistic philosophers. And these are philosophers who are engaged in the sciences, and some of them are in the labs with scientists doing the same sort of work. But we want to make sure we identify correctly behavior as moral. And not every social behavior, perhaps, I don't want to take a firm stand here, but not every social behavior ought to be countenanced as moral behavior. Not every behavior that, perhaps, with big old sort of brackets around this statement, but it might be the case that just because a behavior lends itself to social stability does not mean that it's moral behavior. So I like the account, I really do, because I think that's a good option for giving a naturalized account of morality. But I would maybe hesitate briefly and just go, let's make sure we have our terms right. Let's make sure we have the right concepts that we're studying here. And that's a good role for a philosopher who is a naturalist, who can do the science, to jump into the lab and help out with that. So thank you. I mean, I think that's a pretty neat account.
As far as like utilitarian value on that particular example, they did a study with mice where they showed that a mouse will free his companion when given the option before going for like a food source. Like there was a trap that he could spring this trap and go for food, or he could spring a similar trap and free his friend. And I mean, that would be sort of an example of maximizing happiness for the greater number rather
Okay.
than just going directly for the food himself.
Cool. Yeah.
Example of, I mean, I would consider that a direct
I mean,
example of morality, right?
So again, I do not take me to deny. Please do not take me to be denying that animals can be moral, but
The other animals.
other animals can be moral. Non-human animals can be moral. But I do maybe want to go slowly in making that claim. Just because an animal engages in a behavior doesn't make me think right away, with no other consideration, that the behavior is moral. Just like if a robot were to engage in that behavior, I wouldn't think the robot were necessarily being moral. I might arrive at that conclusion. But just because I see similar behavior in other animals doesn't make me jump to immediately the conclusion that that behavior is an example of morality, because morality might have other facets, non-behavioral facets to it. So again, I like the example. I think it's a neat avenue for exploration, and I think it's one that naturalistic philosophers ought to be engaged in.
If social behavior, or well, I guess if you take morality to, the function of morality to be stabilizing groups, wouldn't social behavior, regardless of what it was, that stabilized a group, be considered moral?
Yep, if that's the correct conception of morality, then yep. I'm just not sure that it is. I'm not sure that, because okay, here's one example. Here's one example. You might think, Kant certainly did, that you have moral obligations to yourself if you're alone in the woods, and you live, again, I love Alaska because we have real-life examples of people who are kind of completely off the grid. And you might think that they have moral obligations to themselves, maybe to nature. And there it's hard to see how you're connecting that conception of morality up with social stability. Now, it's probably going to turn out that social stability is a good thing on the correct moral view. That seems plausible, doesn't it? Society seems to be a good thing, but we have to do the work. We have to get the theory right first, and then we'll see. Once we have the right theory, we'll see if it turns out that society is a good thing. I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to get that answer, but again, we got to do the theorizing and see if the results that we get. James?
So, there's a couple of things.
Give it to me loud and proud. I'm deaf.
There was a couple of things I was wanting to point out is, one, those conclusions about, like divine command theory, well, conclusions depending on either horn you take, have to be accepted regardless of whether you decide to be, use it as an argument for a deity. Even if you just accepted that a deity exists based on some other argument or no argument whatsoever, you still have to accept a lot of these conclusions as being true regardless.
Conditionally true, right? So on the condition that God's commands create morality, we would have to accept these?
Well, or if just because you've already accepted the existence of God doesn't mean that you don't have to address these issues.
That's fair. And then the youth-thrower dilemma would come into full force at that point in the
Right.
argument. Yeah, okay,
The
fair.
first thing that I wanted to say was that as far as accepting divine command theory, we could say that God, when God says that He is good, we have to understand what His definition of good is, so then we would look at the examples that He gives. So I'm coming from a Christian background. And so we look at the examples that he gives of, like, these are the things that he says is good. And so whenever he is saying that he is good, you can use these examples of, this is what he's saying that he is like. He's good like this. We accept that the things that he says are good, then we can also, with reasonable firmness, accept that God himself is good, even if, as it talks about, he is, in some sense, saying he approves of himself.
Okay. I guess I have two things. First is, I'm not entirely sure how that avoids the thrust of the youth-thrower dilemma, the exact problems that I discussed today. So maybe you can sort of fill me in there a little bit more of your thoughts. The second thing, I always worry when we look at Scripture and we see that there are what we take to be horrible things commanded by God. And if you will get people who do what's called biting the bullet on that point, where they just go, yeah, look, I know rape seems really bad, but God commanded it, so it has to be good. I know that genocide, I know that, all sorts of really terrible things seem really bad, but God commanded it, and so they have to be good. I really start to worry about that person. Because there just seem to be some things that are so obviously wrong that were God to command them, I would just go, you're wrong, God, sorry. Like, that just can't be right.
The other thing I realized that I wanted to point out, sorry, is that you said that God is almost like, even if, where was it? It said, like, God is a feature of the universe, and so if morality is based in God, then morality is just a feature of the universe, and it evolves into more reality, or I forget the other theory. Anyway, I would argue that God isn't necessarily a feature of the universe. Necessarily a feature of the universe.
So he's some feature outside of the universe?
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe the way I put it is not the best, but there I think we still have the same problem. Morality just is a necessary existent, wherever you want to locate it. But that was just the claim of moral realism. Morality is a necessary existent. So it doesn't seem to get you anywhere. Yeah.
So, this is kind of off topic, but we were talking about how God doesn't have to, but we're arguing that God has to be morally good and what's right. And it's interesting that, we look at our Greek gods and God is saying that if we accept them, then they would do bad things, and they just accepted that.
Right.
Society accepted that. So why do we in society today have to assume that everything God does is good?
That's a good question. I definitely was going into this talk thinking of sort of what I will call the traditional theist who follows the Abrahamic God, so Islam, Judaism, Christianity, of all varieties of each. So what's interesting, perhaps, is the very context in which Plato was writing this is the exact context that you're speaking of, I'm sure, was part of your point. And it was Euthyphro, who was a seer, or a priest, or an oracle, who thought he understood what piety is, what goodness is, because it's what the gods love, is what he says. And it's in that context that Socrates gives this argument. So, even if we're polytheistic, as long as we think the gods have a connection to morality, we're going to have this same problem. If we don't think the gods have any connection to morality, yeah, okay, we don't have this problem. But we have some pretty terrifying gods, perhaps. Some truly amoral gods. And I suppose one might worship them out of fear. In that instance, if you didn't think God was good and you were just terrified of God, you might worship him or her or them in an attempt to appease them. But I would call that I would call that the behavior worship, but not true adulation, right? So they're pretending to honor the gods to avoid punishment. They're not really honoring the gods. Good.
So it seems to me through the discussion, are we looking for like a moral objectivity? And if so, can't we just say that find an absolute zero in morality, just saying the worst pain that the global consciousness of all humans can think of all the time for everybody is the worst. And just say that whatever takes us away from that is therefore moral.
So there's sort of a scale of...
That's right, you just find that zero, that bedrock, and then you just, anything that goes away from that is therefore moral, and that's where you get your moral objectivity from.
So, one thing to say is, I don't think you have to have moral objectivity on the ultimate account of morality, on whatever account ends up being right. Certainly, what we call cultural subjectivism or cultural relativism is not an objectivist sort of account. And even though I sort of called it into question here, it might turn out that I'm just wrong about that, and cultural relativism is the right view. So we don't have to go objectivist. If we do go objectivist, sure, that would be a good way. John Stuart Mill is at least in that ballpark, right? He's going to identify pain and the privation of pleasure as the only thing that's truly intrinsically bad, and pleasure and the absence of pain as the only thing that's truly intrinsically good. And then what we're supposed to do is try to maximize the most amount of people's pleasure. So, yeah, again, and that's probably going to end up being a naturalistic account. Probably, because you're grounding it in some psychological feature of, if you think morality is restricted just to humans, then of humans. If you think morality is a broader scope, then all animals, because all animals, like Peter Singer gives this argument, he gives a very good utilitarian argument about why you all of you meat eaters, myself included, are really terrible people, because animals experience pain. So they have to be sort of weighted in the utilitarian calculus. It's a more subtle view than that. That'll do for our purposes. So yeah, no, I think that's good. No, sorry, over. Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah, could you go back to that, one of your last slides talking about if God was a reporter, I guess.
Sure. Absolutely. I think we're here. So God is a reporter of morality?
Right.
Uh-huh.
So, if God was giving people morals, and I guess the argument that you said there was the difference between believers in God and those who
The theist and the atheist.
Right.
Yeah.
If God was a giver of morals or a reporter of morals in a way where he gave it to everyone all at the same time, through a naturalistic approach or an evolutionary one, then by giving them the basic fundamental senses of morality, then that would still kind of
Make room for God in perfection. Okay, so two things. Maybe three. Definitely two. One is fair enough. But then, once again, atheists have that moral sense, and we have no reason to expect that they're less moral than theists. So, cool. I'm down with that. The second thing I want to say there is to ask this question. Is the claim that it has to be that way? That the only way that it's work is if the only way it works is if God gives us that sense? Do you think? No, maybe? So the only way we get morality is if God creates us with a moral sense. That's the only way it can work.
I guess so. He did it through a naturalistic way, where it is done through evolution, where everyone, whether you believe in God or not, has a basic understanding of different moral principles.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good, thank you, perfect. So, I suppose I want to say that I've presented, many great people before me have presented an alternative to it to it must be that way, right? We could give a different naturalistic account about how we get that moral sense without appeal to God. And because it no longer has to be that way, now we're just weighing theories, right? Which theory is better? And it's pretty clear, I hope, that a theory that appeals to God, either for explanation or prediction, is always going to fare worse than a theory that doesn't appeal to God. And then I accept the non-theistic theory there because it has better predictive power or better explanatory power. Did that answer your question? Pay attention to Eduardo. He's going to call you out because I'm not necessarily... Tristan, is that you're up next?
Yes. You said the problem of the divine command theory was God working on his whim, potentially doing horrible things. But by that very divine command theory, you say what is right and wrong is what God commands is right and wrong. Therefore, you're saying God doing horrible things by that, they're not horrible, so therefore that seems to be contradicting itself.
So, well, it's not contradicting itself. I'm doing what is called begging the question against the theists. Because I want to say that those truly are horrible things. And the theist who accepts divine command theory, and there have been a lot of them, again, so I'm a historian of philosophy primarily. I study 17th and 18th century European philosophy, so I got guys like David Hume, Rene Descartes, women like Margaret Cavendish. Those are all the people that my mind goes to right away. So Descartes seemed to accept something like divine command theory, and he just goes, yeah, what can I say? Those are the right things to do. Those are good in those instances. Even though we normally think of them as horrendously evil, right? Exercise your imaginations for a second and come up with some action that is truly, utterly, and terribly, as you see it right now, horrendous. It's a morally abhorrent. On the divine command theory, were God to command that, Justin, you're absolutely right. That would be, on that theory, that would be the right thing to do.
Yes.
And I
just the
suppose at
same
that
way
point-
God saying that, God commanding horrible things would be either in a circular argument begging the question or putting oneself above God.
I mean, fair enough, but I guess at that point, I kind of just shrug my shoulders and go, if in order to accept the moral argument, I have to accept that things like rape could in principle be moral, I'm just, at that point, I just do kind of shrug my shoulders and go, so much the worse for theism. If that's what you have to accept, which I absolutely agree with you, that's the commitment of divine command theory. But if that's what you have to accept, I get off the boat at that point. I'm done. I mean, I really am. That can't be right. That can't be right.
So you mentioned that you had a kind of critique of the social or cultural
Oh no.
approach. And
David's a sociologist in the room.
So yeah, my question is just, what's the critique of the possibility that we as individuals in a society have created morality in the same way that we create any number of cultural beliefs?
Sure.
This would obviously be a kind of a relative version of morality that changes over time, changes
Sure.
across place.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah. Not a problem. Not a problem.
And perhaps even that, like, some people who have more kind of relative power to shape beliefs and ideologies in society have played a larger role than others in shaping what we consider to be a morality of, the society we're a part of.
Are there cross-societal moralities?
Yeah, for sure there's probably some. And so the possibility is, the question would be, are there cross-societal moralities of societies who have never had any kind of contact historically or otherwise?
Well, okay. I always hate appealing to Godwin's law. I really do. I feel bad about myself when I appeal to Godwin's law, but I'm going to do it. I know it's not the right thing to do. I'm going to do it anyway. I really want to say, so everyone knows Godwin's law. The longer discussion goes, the higher the probability that someone's going to reference Hitler. I really want to say the Nazis were wrong. I really want to say that the entire society that birthed Nazism is immoral. And it's not clear how we can do that if we accept society as the source of morality. If we can develop some moral standard that can allow us to say of other societies that some of them are moral, some of them are immoral, good. But then we've sort of given up the society aspect of the source of morality. There are a few other things that happen here. One is if to say that, eating meat is wrong, if that just means my culture disapproves of eating meat, then I can't make any, well, first thing is I can't disagree with a member of another society where eating meat is approved of. Because when they say eating meat is right, all they're really saying is my society approves of eating meat. And then it looked like we were having a disagreement, but we're really not. So that one's maybe not so bad, but it is an oddity. It is an oddity. I also find it pretty problematic. So depending on how we break down societies, maybe we want to go super micro, maybe we want to go sort of at the level of nations or states. But I can imagine like a skinhead who wakes up one day and goes, so now we're just restricting that society, to the skinhead society, who wakes up one day and goes, you know what? Everything I believe my whole life is wrong. The tenets of, I don't know what they are, but the tenets of skinheadism I'm now realizing are incorrect. I'm going to do my best to fight against skinheadism. Well, as long as they stay within that society, they're being immoral. And again, that just is an oddity. It's just, it's something that I see as misunderstanding what we mean by morality in our own moral language. Oh, yeah.
Geez, that was a second ago. Okay. The Pew report that you cited up in there, it says that something like 3% of the American population identifies as atheist.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Another like 4 or so.
It's a very small percent.
It's a very
yeah.
small percentage. And yet, the percentage of people in American prisons who identify as atheists is 1%. So one could say that empirically, atheists commit less crime than theists overall. And yet, there's this massive PR problem because also in America, it's totally copacetic to be outwardly hateful towards atheists and non-theists. There's no word for it. If you're a sexist, you're a racist, people have a name for it. But if you're like, those atheists, I just don't trust them and don't want my kids to marry them, there's no word for that.
Yeah.
So how do non-theists philosophize their way out of a situation which empirically is proven to not be true?
Hopefully this way. It's baby steps, right? I mean, it's baby steps. It's making these sorts of arguments and trying to change the sort of cultural mindset about atheists and their relationship to morality. But a wholesale change? I don't know. Yeah, let's just put our heads together and try to figure it out, I guess. Yeah, Jim?
I just wanted to comment in response to that, you'd have to do the test of whether they were atheists before they went to prison or not.
No atheists in a foxhole.
Well, I'm just pointing out that, like, by saying that if it's 1% of atheists while they're in prison, then it kind of skews the numbers because some people might be found atheists either because they're in prison or because it's even less popular to be atheist in prison. So I just wanted to point out that.
But the prison population is even less tolerant than the American population. Eric?
I get a second chance here, but maybe I'm being overly simplistic, but I sort of agree with the sociologist here. And I don't accept, that society cannot, in fact, come up with pseudo-objective, agreed upon moral norms. And I just point out I'm trying to find an example where the golden rule does not imply correct moral behavior. And I don't see a lot of cross-cultural problem with it. So what's wrong? I mean, everybody kind of thinks that's a pretty good base.
Love it.
I told my kids that anyway, so don't tell me I'm wrong now.
Yeah, it is a sort of noticeably common sentiment, right? The golden rule or something very similar to it. Rich, let me ask you, because it's so common, would you, just off the cuff, right, we can think about this a little bit more, do you think it's more likely that society is the source of the golden rule or something like rationality is the source of the golden rule? It's being so common across many different cultures.
Oh.
Chicken or egg.
You're asking a physicist whether rationality Yes, I think it's rationality, but I think there is a very strong element of rationality working in human civilization, in human culture.
Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. But then the source would be rationality. And cultures can reinforce moral codes, right? Some cultures can perfectly well be moral, develop the right sort of moral codes, and then, for lack of a better word, indoctrinate their citizens to follow that moral code. Or teach them how to use their reason well so that they can realize that that's the right moral code. There's all sorts of ways societies can influence morality. I'm just hesitant to admit that it's the source of morality. So I think I actually agree with you, Rich. I think we're in agreement.
I think the golden rule is a social thing.
You think it's a purely social?
Yeah.
Okay.
There are groups of civilizations out there where it's perfectly fine for the women to never vote, never show any skin at all. If that's right, why would I be showing skin and not allow them to do it?
Thank you for that, because that lets me make a really cool distinction that philosophers love to make. Philosophy is all about distinctions. It's one of the main things we do. This is a really good distinction. We need to distinguish between cultural practices and cultural values. So what I would be curious about, and this will be an empirical question, we just have to go out and do some research and test, but I would be very curious to see if they differed in value or if they just made some poor decisions relative to those values. So again, that's sort of an empirical question, but in a lot of, so here's one example, right? Here's one example. In a society that has very low resources, I love science, I love science fiction. Love science fiction. Dune is one of my favorite books. And in the Fremen society in Dune, it's a very harsh life, it's very hard to survive. So in an effort to say, promote the cultural value of keeping the culture alive, people who aren't able to contribute to the success of the society are killed. And then they're harvested for their water, because it's a desert planet. But, so that would be crazy for us to do. We would never think, right, like Soylent Green's another great example here. Right? They ran out of places to bury bodies, so they started making food out of them. Right? We would think that's crazy. That is obviously immoral behavior. Fair enough, situation's different. Doesn't necessarily reflect the value, which in the case of Dune is to promote the strength and success of the society. So that's a very important distinction in this discussion. And not every society is going to make good decisions when they come up with their cultural practices.
But that's judged on our society. It's a good decision in their society.
Sure. No, I mean, yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Do you have other questions?
Jabez, you and I can talk in you're my class. You go to my office hours.
I'll ask you.
Yeah, sure.
This goes back to Rich's point. Even if we were to find this commonality, say every culture in the planet has a certain belief, would you say something about whether or not that would make it, I mean, jumping from the everybody believes X, then X must be right. Right. That kind of idea.
Yeah, good. So I want to say absolutely not.